I'll give this just like a minute, and then we should be good. Should have a couple. Yeah, let's get a couple people on here, so we should be good. And give it a minute, and we will get to it. I'm going to start now. Thank you all for joining us today for this very special virtual event. Welcome to the Book Law Presents Conversation With. Today's guest is the class of 1937 professor of law at Tulane Law School and is one of our nation's top experts on privacy and on privacy in the media. Amy Gajda. Professor Gajda has written and provided commentary for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Slate, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. Professor Gajda has a new book out today called Seek and Hide, the Tangled History of the Right to Privacy. In this book, Professor Gajda examines the long history of legal battles over the right to privacy and provides much needed and important context for today's discourse on privacy in the age of social media and the internet. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you. So today's format will be as follows. We're going to have Professor Gajda speak about her book, and she will talk about the contents of what's inside. And then what we'll do is then we will shift it over for questions, and we'll do a mixture of both audience and some questions that I had pre-written for this event. And so with that being said, I now cede the floor to Professor Gajda.
Sounds good. Thank you. And you can definitely call me Amy. And if people have any questions as I go here, feel free to put them in the chat too. And I'm going to try to pay attention to that. That's what I do during my classes. So I hope I can multitask in that way. Thank you again so much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. I love the bookstore. I love the area where you are. So it's a real delight for me. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk a little bit about the right to privacy generally. And the reason why I wanted to do this was because a lot of people suggest that we don't have any privacy anymore. And in reality, we not only have privacy has come roaring back to some extent, but it has also existed from the very beginning of the United States. And so what I want to do is just talk with you a little bit about the progression of privacy and the way that the law thinks about it. And then, as I suggest, take your questions during or after as well. So one of the way I begin the book is with the story of Marion Manola. And Marion Manola was a Broadway actress in the 1890s, the 1880s and 1890s. And back then, what actresses would do is they would wear tunics and then tights. And tights were scandalous at the time. So dresses went all the way to the ground generally and covered women's legs. And so if you wore tights, this was, to great scandal. So Marion Manola, because she was an actress on Broadway, wore tights as a part of her art, as I say. And she had previously worn tights for another role. And her picture was taken in tights, and she was walking down a street in Manhattan one day with her daughter. And she saw her body in tights being exposed then in a store window in an ad for this Broadway play. And she felt that this was wrong. She was horribly embarrassed in front of her daughter. And she decided that she never wanted to be photographed in tights ever again. And yet, because she was such a famous actress, and because the producer of the play that she was in knew that it would get more coverage in the media, and that he'd be able to use an image of her in her tights in the same sort of marketing campaign that he had previously, he decided to take a picture of her surreptitiously. And so during a performance, he put what was called a snap camera up in the area above the stage. And at one point during the second act, she runs into the arms of her co-star. And at that moment, the snap camera goes off. There's a sound, there's a flash of light, and Marion Manola has been captured in her tights. She immediately brings a right to privacy, in effect, lawsuit against the producer who took her image. And a court decided that not only would that producer not be able to reproduce that image in any way, the court also decided that, in fact, she would that the producer should never even make it into a picture in the first place. So don't develop the picture, and certainly don't publish the picture. So that story then is a part of a very important law review article that was published just a few months later called The Right to Privacy. And this law review article was published by two lawyers, one of whom you know, and that is Louis Brandeis, who later became Supreme Court Justice, and his dear friend and law partner, Sam Warren. And what they did is they used the story of Marion Manola to suggest that we all need a right to privacy. That what was happening in the day is that publishers were, like Joseph Pulitzer, for example, were publishing scandalous news stories. And also that technology, like this new snap camera that had suddenly moved from a studio and into the street, then would also be, had the real potential to invade privacy. So this story of Marion Manola was proof of the evil among publishers, proof of the evil that technology would how that would invade our privacy. And so there's language throughout this law review article written in 1890 that's just beautiful, and it celebrates privacy in a really important way. It suggests that we all have the right to be let alone, that things that are whispered in closets, for example, should not be broadcast to the world. So there's really, really beautiful language in it. What's interesting about it, though, and part of the clash that I focus on in the book, is this right to know. And the trick here is that Sam Warren, Louis Brandeis's law partner, was really good friends with President Grover Cleveland. And President Grover Cleveland also really wanted a right to privacy. And the reason why he really wanted a right to privacy was because he had married what was in effect his adopted daughter. And so her father had died. He had Grover Cleveland had basically been quasi uncle to this child from the day she was born. When her father died, she became his ward, and he was like her adoptive father. When she turned 18, they started to date. And in addition, Grover Cleveland had a number of extramarital affairs, a baby as well. And so he had every reason to want the right to privacy. Sam Warren, because he was really good friends with Grover Cleveland and also was the son-in-law of a famous politician, argued then in the right to privacy that even politicians have the right to be let alone, the right to privacy, that newspapers should not ferret out their past misdeeds and reveal them to the public. So even in the right to privacy, even in this story, in effect, of Marion Manola, you see that clash then with the right to know, and the way that politicians have for a long time, from the very beginning of the United States, argued for privacy in their so-called private life, and suggested that news journalists were out of control. Does someone have a question?
So right now, I think we're still good. I think we're
Okay,
just,
great, sounds good. So there's always been this tension. This law review article comes out in 1890, and it takes a little while for the right to privacy to catch on. The very first, the most famous case, and perhaps one that had the most impact, involved, right after the right to privacy, involved a young woman who was 17, and a girl, I should say, and she had a picture taken for her boyfriend, and it was a picture that was somewhat scandalous at the time. Her collar is a little bit low. You can see her collarbone, and she's looking off into the distance as you would sort of a cameo shot, and an advertiser of a flower manufacturer used that image in its advertising. And so she brought an invasion of privacy claim against that advertiser. And that advertiser then argued that it had the right to use her picture. And it successfully did that at New York's highest court. And so in New York, that meant after that decision, that people could use other people's images in advertising. And of course, there was great uproar about this. Why take this image of the 17-year-old girl and allow a flower company to use it in an ad in that way? And so immediately the New York legislature passed a law that suggested that the use of people's images in advertising was in fact an invasion of privacy. And as I suggest in the book, one of the problems with this is that that's basically been the law of New York from that moment in the early 1900s through to today. And so even though we have some of these other types of invasions of privacy, torts, and I'll explain that in just a moment, in New York, the ability to bring a cause of action for invasion of privacy is often limited only to the use or the misuse of someone's image in advertising. And so even though the New York legislature was at the forefront of invasion of privacy, actually it was, New York is very much behind the times with regard to privacy for that reason. So we move ahead now. So there's rumblings of the right to privacy. There's that sense of how we define privacy. And so throughout the 1900s, from 1890, let's say, through to 1960 or so, there are a few hundred cases that have mentioned privacy and decided certain things. Among them, things I think are very interesting, very early cases involving children who died shortly after birth, and images of those children that were taken and published in newspapers. Courts decided that parents have the right to privacy in that image of a deceased child. So really beautiful language, again, in those sorts of cases that, again, show the clash then between the publication of truth and the right to privacy. In 1960, so we'll zoom ahead to 1960, a famous law professor wrote an article that he called Privacy. And what he did is he looked at all the cases that had talked about privacy in some way. And he decided that there were 4 different categories. The first, for invasion of privacy. So when we say invasion of privacy, this is what he suggested we mean. First, a tort called misappropriation. And that is then the use of someone's image without their permission, generally in advertising. The second, it's called intrusion into seclusion. And I consider it the peeping Tom tort. It's when someone looks in on another person when they're in a secluded space. Third, publication of private facts, something that I call the gossip tort. In that wrong, when someone brings a lawsuit based on that civil wrong, the claim is that they've told something to others that was private, and there's no news value inherent in the information that was published. So that's the third. And I'm going to give you examples of this, modern day examples, in just a moment. And the fourth is something called false light. And that's very similar to defamation. It's different from defamation, though, because instead of requiring damage to someone's reputation, all that false light suggests is that the false information has to be highly offensive. And here's my shout out to Ohio. Back about 15 years ago or so, the Ohio Supreme Court, for the first time, recognized the tort called false light. So just 15 years ago-ish. So something, so very recently, at least in terms of law. And this Ohio Supreme Court said it was doing so in order to protect the residents of Ohio, that there was so much damage being done on the internet and otherwise, that even though it had rejected this tort previously as being too similar to defamation, it embraced it because of the damage going on the internet. So zoom ahead from 1960 to 1977.
Before we go in further, someone wanted to know, in regards to the third of these series of things that you were talking about, they wanted to know how that differentiated, or essentially how do like gossip magazines essentially, or how are they able to get around that to publish the kind of like tabloids that you see, and then the television programs like Entertainment Tonight and things like that.
Right. No, that's a really wonderful question. And the answer is this trump card that media has. And the trump card that media has and has had for a very long time is this concept of newsworthiness. And so therefore, if, for example, the president is very sick, traditionally, if this sort of information were published about any one of us, maybe then this would be an invasion of privacy. But if in fact the president was very sick and a news organization published that the president's medical chart, that information then would be protected. The news organization that did that would be protected because of the news value of that information. If it were published about any other of us who were not politicians, let's say, we might be able to bring an invasion of privacy action based on this publication of private facts. And so that's a very long answer to tabloid magazines know that as long as the information is considered newsworthy, who is dating whom, for example, courts have said, oh, that's very newsworthy information. It's just when we get into the areas that have been traditionally off limits in the United States. Those are sexual information, medical information, nudity, and some financial information. Those four categories have been somewhat routinely protected in the United States as being private information, basically from the very beginning of the United States. So when we delve into those sorts of areas, then that's when courts can begin to really decide, you know what, this has gone too far. This is not newsworthy. And they're doing it in very, very interesting ways today, certainly. I hope that answered the question for the person. So in addition to these four torts, in 1977, there's something called the restatement. And what the restatement is it's sort of like an encyclopedia of law for judges and courts around the United States. And what it's meant to do is it's meant to make law relatively the same across the US. So what restatement authors do is they read through all the cases and they try to compile then a definition for each of these torts and each of these civil wrongs. That's what a tort is. A tort is different from criminal law. If you violate tort law, you don't go to prison, you don't go to jail, you have to pay the person who brings the cause of action against you. You pay the plaintiff money for that, and that's what these are. So in addition to these 4 privacy torts, the other sort of vaguely interesting, well, I think super interesting, I hope you agree, privacy tort that exists is something called intentional infliction of emotional distress. And so today, when we think about invasion of privacy in those 4 torts, mainly the 3 is what I'm going to be talking about: misappropriation, intrusion into seclusion, publication of private facts. Those 3 torts are the ones that we think of most often when we think of invasion of privacy, someone invading our privacy. The 4th that comes into play is something called intentional infliction of emotional distress. And even though we might think that pulling a prank on another person is an expression, it'll be protected by the First Amendment, actually in a number of cases, courts have suggested that when we intentionally inflict emotional distress on another person, we can be liable for that behavior. And so therefore, when people bring invasion of privacy causes of action, that's one of the reasons why, or that's another tort, another civil wrong that they bring against the person they consider the wrongdoer. So we've had all these torts for a very long time, from really the 1930s, certainly in the 1960s, and definitely in the 1970s. But what happened in the 70s and 80s is that courts came to really trust journalism. So these were the days of Vietnam. They were the days of Watergate. And because of that, then courts suggested that we're going to leave it to the media to decide what is news. We don't feel comfortable being journalists. We're going to leave it to the media to decide, what sorts of information have news value and what don't. So for a very long time, courts, even though we had these privacy torts, courts would decide that media itself, that journalism itself had the right to decide what is newsworthy and what isn't. And for me, just in saying this, the one case that comes to mind that I think sort of shows that is there was a case from Oklahoma in which there was a woman who was raped, and her attacker, she was incapacitated, and her attacker took video of the rape. She then saw the video. She gave the video to the police. The police gave it to a television station, and the television station used some images and video from the tape of the rape. She brought an invasion of privacy claim against the TV station, and the judge in the case decided that she did not have a valid claim because this information was newsworthy, that it showed that in fact the rapist had videotaped the rape, and it also showed that the media knew as much that it could prove in effect that this had happened and that police had given them the tape. So that sort of shows you, I think, in this very, very heart-rending sort of moment, how even in those sorts of cases, then the media would win back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. But also in 1995, 1996 comes the internet with a vengeance. And suddenly, publishers are not only journalists. Suddenly, everyone with a Facebook account or with the ability to create a website can publish whatever they would like. And so what's happened now in the past 25 or so years is that these torts have been used far more frequently against publishers in ways that I think are dangerous to some extent. I celebrate some of this, certainly, but I think that they're dangerous to some extent at a time when media is having financial difficulty. Media can be chilled in reporting truth, and that's the reason why I'm particularly worried about that. Now, that said, let me give you some examples of misappropriation, intrusion into seclusion, and publication of private facts, so that you sort of understand from what I've just said, precisely the sorts of situations in which these torts would apply. So the first is misappropriation. One of the cases that my students really enjoy with misappropriation is, and again, you'll remember that misappropriation is the misuse of someone's name or image in advertising generally. It can be more than that, but it's mostly in advertising. So when Michael Jordan, this was a number of years ago, but when Michael Jordan was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame, a grocery store in Chicago took out an ad that said, "Congratulations," and then showed his number, and then also used the color of the Chicago Bulls in the ad. So it was a "Congratulations to Michael Jordan" ad. Michael Jordan had not given that grocery store permission to use his name in an ad, even though it was a congratulatory ad. And he sued then the grocery store for misappropriation successfully for $9 million. And the way the jury decided what was due was because they suggested that if the grocery store had paid Michael Jordan for the use of his name, then they would have had to have paid $9 million. Second example, intrusion into seclusion. Classic intrusion into seclusion claim is when people put cameras into public bathrooms. To put a hidden camera into a public bathroom is absolutely intruding on another person's seclusion. And courts have routinely decided that. So that's sort of the use of technology there, this shift toward greater privacy in the same way that Warren and Brandeis argued it in 1890. And then publication of private facts, a really famous case that I'd be delighted to talk about if anybody would like to, the Hulk Hogan case. That was when professional wrestler Hulk Hogan, unbeknownst to him, apparently, someone took video of him having sex with a woman on a bed, and thereafter gave that video to the Gawker website. Gawker then published that video, and Hulk Hogan brought what was in effect a publication of private facts lawsuit against Gawker for publishing non-newsworthy information. And ultimately, a jury decided that he was due millions of dollars for that. And that, in fact, it was not newsworthy, that this nude video, this sex tape, in effect, was not newsworthy.
So actually, I have a question about that. I do remember that being like one of the biggest like privacy cases that I had remembered in my lifetime. And I remember just kind of like this, there's this tension between the media and privacy advocates about just kind of like how far does one side go versus the other. And so I wanted to ask you, some of the background information about that case is that, Hogan had gotten his legal team bankrolled by billionaire Peter Thiel, who had been outed by Gawker. And so there's this kind of like more, not, I wouldn't say moral gray area, but like there's like this uneasiness of the fact that a billionaire could bankroll a case like that to essentially cease a publication that he had a personal vendetta against. And so do you think that, where do you think, you know, advocates on both sides of this discussion, where do they, where are some of their worries more justified and where they're not?
So I think that for me, having studied privacy, and I don't think I say this in the book, but I'll tell you that I knew from the beginning of the internet that there would be a website that would publish a sex tape featuring a celebrity, and that it would, in fact, the question of the news value of that tape would be what a court would have to decide. And so I was sitting in my office right here, and I got an email from a former student of mine saying, "Hey, you're right. It looks like Gawker has published this sex tape featuring Hulk Hogan." So from the very beginning, I predicted this sort of thing. And you know, this is not to sort of pat myself on the back, but it goes to your question, I think. Um, People who study privacy recognized that this was one of those gray areas that had yet to be decided. Back in the day when we trusted journalists to make those news judgments, journalists would never have published a sex tape like this. And so this was sort of the new journalism, and it would be up to a court to decide. Again, traditionally, nudity, sexual information, all those things have been protected in the United States. So it wasn't any surprise to me, for example, that Gawker lost that case. Now, you're exactly right that it's troubling when you have someone with a vendetta against a media organization to bring a claim like this and to cease, cause the publication to cease. And one of the suggestions, which I think is very interesting that they do in some other countries, is capping out one of these an invasion of privacy claim in a way that would prevent news organizations from going bankrupt for it. Now I've talked with a lot of friends of mine who have represented these publishers in the past, and what they've said to me is, I wish that Gawker had come to me to ask the question whether or not we should publish the tape, because I would have told them not to. So in other words, even people who represent publishers recognize that that's a gray area, very, very, an area that had yet to be decided. And now we sort of know that, no, you can't publish things like that without at least potentially facing an invasion of privacy lawsuit. So do you have any follow-up questions or?
One of our audience members wanted to ask whether, in regards to the torts, if verbal abuse was actionable in regards to privacy and just kind of like just like the harmfulness that things of that nature can do.
Sure, that's a great question, and certainly if someone said something that revealed private information about me. So, for example, if I had a sexually transmitted infection, for example, that's one of those areas that's always been traditionally off limits, one of those very private areas. If I had a sexually transmitted infection and you came or someone came to my class and said, "Hey, Amy Gajda, you have a sexually transmitted infection and I know it." That's speech, but that speech is punishable through invasion of privacy because what that person has done is revealed my private information with no news value there. And so it's very likely that I would win an invasion of privacy lawsuit against that person who spoke that truth. And so that's again what I think is really interesting about the right to privacy. We know so much about the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Well, privacy has always come up against that. And also that's one of those cases where it's possible that a person outed in that way could also win an intentional infliction of emotional distress claim. And so those torts often come together. And certainly today, courts are much more amenable to finding liability for speech in precisely situations like that. So that's a very long answer. The short answer is yes, that even though we have freedom of speech, this right to privacy clashes with it, comes up against it, and sometimes wins in a battle with the First Amendment.
Now that we're just kind of talking, a hypothetical in my head as you were going through that thought exercise. What if, say, someone knows that X person has transmittable disease, but that their partner may not know, and they out them in that way? Is that still punishable by law?
So it's a really wonderful question. And here, at least traditionally, if only one person is told traditionally, that is not enough for a publication of private facts claim. Enough people have to be told so that the information it gets out there. And certainly in some cases, doctors have to reveal certain medical information to family members and sometimes partners of others, or urge people to do it themselves. Here, though, if someone had done this and they'd only told one person, traditionally, again, that would not be this publication of private facts. But what's happened in the past 2 years is that more and more courts are suggesting that by telling one person, it can still become public, because that one person can very easily go on the internet and announce the information to everyone else. And so therefore, what used to be a restriction on publication of private facts has shifted a little bit to suggest that sometimes telling one person could be enough to support a publication of private facts claim. But the whole idea, at least originally, was you tell someone's private information to enough people, or you post it to the internet, that then can be enough for an invasion of privacy. And I'll give you another example of the Hulk Hogan sort of thing to show you how Hulk Hogan, I think, has that case has had an effect on plaintiffs' attorneys being eager to bring cases against media. So remember that I told you there was that case involving a rape tape where the court said, hey, this is newsworthy. What happened just a couple of years after the Hulk Hogan case settled was that ESPN published information that a New York Giants football player had needed to have his finger amputated after a fireworks accident. And they
remember that.
Yeah,
great. Jason Pierre-Paul.
Exactly right. And so what ESPN did was, in addition to this tweet that said, hey, he's in the hospital, he needed his finger amputated, ESPN also included then a medical chart of the NFL player. And that medical chart then, the court decided was conceivably not newsworthy, that Jason Pierre-Paul had an invasion of privacy lawsuit based on publication of private facts against ESPN, not for publishing the information that he was in the hospital or needed his finger amputated, but for going beyond and publishing his actual medical record. So it shows you, again, the sorts of things that have been protected in the United States, even when we're talking about, mainstream media, when we're talking about stuff that that certainly, I think, if I were, because I worked as a journalist for a number of years, that I would have conceivably published. So that's the chilling time that we're in right now for journalism. Journalism is facing this real backlash in defamation cases, and it's also having to fend off these invasion of privacy cases, and also intentional infliction of emotional distress cases. That's bad news for journalism. I think it's pretty good news for everyday people, because the way courts are moving, we have increased privacy in things that to me are shocking. And I'll just give you some examples, and you can interrupt me certainly if you'd like. But one example is just within the past few months, the U.S. Supreme Court has suggested that we might have privacy in our home addresses because of doxing. And so what doxing is the revelation of someone's home address to try to get people riled up to go to that person's house and to torment that person in some way. And so the US Supreme Court has suggested, well, maybe we should have privacy in home addresses because of the possibility of doxing. Other courts have suggested that when we publish things on Facebook, if we intend our audience to be very narrow, maybe we can still retain privacy in that information. And so that's really good news for teenagers and others who might post things that they later regret. The courts are suggesting that even though it's out there on the internet, as long as there's the intention of the poster that it was not to go beyond a friend group, for example, that maybe that information should be protected on privacy grounds. There's privacy. Oh, sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, so in regards to that, I guess not to be a person who thinks like in negative tones, but I mean that kind of opens up the possibility for politicians and public figures to kind of like if they kind of say very outlandish and heinous stuff, it kind of gives them an out in regards to being able to not facing any kind of consequence for saying maybe racist, misogynistic kind of stuff.
That's such a great point. And that's why we have to really hope that the right to privacy does not go so far as to encompass that. So my hope and my belief, my very strong belief, is that we'll always have that newsworthiness question in these invasion of privacy cases. We'll always have courts willing to say, hey, politician, if you're going to run for that office, we get to investigate your past. We get to try to figure out what you wrote on the internet. There's no invasion of privacy in that because that information is newsworthy. And I predict and really believe that we will always have that, so that when you run for political office, that sort of information from one's past, be it a bad post, be it a criminal history, those sorts of things will always be newsworthy. I predict, I think, and that'll be good for democracy. We need to learn about our the people who run for office and otherwise.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it brings me back to I think it's like towards the end of the book, you write about this idea of when does an individual's right to privacy trump the world's right to know something. And I think that's highlights that tension very elegantly. I think, let me see if there's any questions on the chat board right now. We've got one about your background, but I think we can do that towards the end as we wrap up the discussion. I wanted to ask you, in regards to this idea of like the powerful in democracy, you really go into this idea of like the Trump tax returns and other. I mean, and throughout the book, you kind of highlight the private failings of numerous very powerful men and their their knee-jerk reaction to privacy. Why is it? I guess the question would be, why? Why? When holding what are the legal and cultural norms that give powerful men the ability to kind of like hide these public failings from other people? Because when you look back in U.S. history, I think one of the most best examples of this kind of deal is the Bill Clinton scandal with Monica Lewinsky. But then it's wild because that got so much coverage, but then you look back at some of the public or the private failings of John F. Kennedy and the kind of the attitude that was there at that time, and kind of brushing to the side, some of his private failings. And yeah, you talk about that.
Sure. And interestingly, as you know, it also includes Thomas Jefferson. It includes Warren Harding. So there are a lot of presidents who tried to claim privacy throughout, leading up to some of our more modern presidents.
Gary Hart as well.
Yeah, and Gary Hart, right? That's a fantastic example. That's exactly right. And so the reason why I think that presidents and others in powerful positions have been able to claim this sort of privacy right, generally the law allows for far more reporting than journalism ethics does. And so as a former journalist and someone who taught journalism ethics for a while, the law is just far more open. If anything's newsworthy, if you think it's newsworthy, go ahead and report it. You'll probably be protected. And I think that's basically still the law in the United States today for the most part. Journalism ethics is much more restrictive. Journalism ethics says, if you think the information is newsworthy, be sure to balance against that news value the individual's interest in privacy, no matter who that person is. And so therefore, if a journalist knows, for example, or believes, is a better way to put it, that there's a politician who is having an affair, that journalist will likely not report on that affair unless that affair has some sort of news value to it. It's not enough that the politician is having an affair. It has to be that the politician is having an affair and is also speaking out about family values, for example. So it's in those sorts of situations that journalists will report. And in other situations, they won't report. And they won't report again. The law would say you're fine with it. But because of journalism ethics, when you ask about sort of these cultural norms, that's a really strong cultural norm in journalism, is these ethics issues. If you violate an ethics provision in many newsrooms, you can be fired. And so that's really the reason why I think a lot of politicians were able to cloak themselves with privacy in a way, because of that. Now today, because journalism is conceivably losing less ground on the actual malice standard in defamation cases, they might be hesitant to report those sorts of things if they fear that the information is false. And so we're in this, as I say, sort of difficult time where courts have suggested, there's a greater right to privacy and information, at the same time suggesting that maybe the actual malice standard is too protective of publishers. So that's sort of that's where we are right now in society. That's a part of the way I think at least the journalism culture thinks about things.
And so I think that's actually a really good spot to kind of wrap up a little bit of the discussion. We're going to ask a couple more questions from the audience, and then we'll kind of do an overround wrap up. One of our audience members wanted to know, why was it important for you to kind of start, in terms of your introduction, talking about Louis Brandeis and what the right to privacy, how it essentially opens up the rest of the book? Why was it important to start that way?
Because a lot of people, even law professors and lawyers, believe that the right to privacy was what really kicked off the right to privacy in the United States. So that law review article from 1890, many people believe that that's what really started it. And there are and two important stories in the book. One, it didn't start in 1890. Those principles began at the very beginning of the United States and carried all the way through, sometimes in very disturbing ways. So that was a reason why I wanted to start with the right to privacy. And the second reason was because a lot of these lawyers and others also have no idea of the way Grover Cleveland influenced the right to privacy, the real reasons why Sam Warren especially wanted to write the right to privacy. We think of Louis Brandeis as being a co-author, and he was, and he celebrates privacy and celebrated privacy. But what he said was that he really agreed to co-author it because Sam Warren wanted to write the piece. And so that's why I wanted to begin with that story about the suggestion with Marion Manola and her tights and how the technology led to the right to privacy and, all that, when in reality, there are sort of these underlying issues, including the fact that privacy has been around for a very long time. And secondly, that there were some troubling reasons why Sam Warren would want to write the right to privacy involving Grover Cleveland.
And then, so lastly, one of our audience members wanted to kind of get an idea of like your background and wanted to know where exactly did you get your formal education and how you got your start in the kind of research and work that you've been doing for the last 20 years.
Sure. So I was lucky enough when I was in high school, I wanted to be a journalist and a lawyer. And so I went to school at the University of Michigan, studied communications, and then went off and was a television news anchor and reporter for right about 8 years, working in Toledo, Ohio, which is where I got my start, on air as an intern, then Salisbury, Maryland, Charlottesville, Virginia, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then in Detroit as a fill-in anchor. When I went to law school at Wayne State in Detroit, I really believed that I was going to continue my journalism career and cover the Supreme Court, and then found that I actually really loved the law and I loved the practice of law. And so I practiced law in Washington, D.C. For a few years, just a couple years, and then went from there to teach at the University of Illinois, where I had an appointment both in the journalism school, teaching ethics, media law, and in the law school, teaching media law and writing and those sorts of topics. And so now I'm so incredibly delighted to be able to research journalism and the law of journalism and media today, and the way media today is influencing law and vice versa. So, all the way back in high school, I'd wanted to do both of these things, and I still am, thank goodness. So thanks for the question.
Absolutely. And so that wraps up our conversation today. Seek and Hide, The Tangled History of the Right to Privacy. Amy Gajda, the book is fantastic. It is a very thorough, analytical understanding of our history to the right to privacy, and it kind of deviates into different cases and subject matters that I think will both surprise you and keep your interest. And we will provide a link at the end of this, at the bottom here of the event page, so that customers can get a copy here at the Book Loft. And once again, I thank you, Amy Gajda, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a delight. Thank you for your wonderful questions as well.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.